Hi, I'm Time's international editor, Dan Stewart, and I'm joined today by Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile and the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thank you for talking with us today. High Commissioner, it must have been a very busy and quite difficult year for you. I think Washington think tank Freedom House lists 80 countries around the world where democratic and human rights have declined since COVID-19 arrived. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it depends on if you're talking of human rights on the political and civil rights, for example. It happens that many countries introduce a lot of measures that are accepted internationally according to the international human rights law, like limiting mobility or the freedom of assembly because of the need to diminish the spread of the virus. But in some countries, they have gone a little bit further what is accepted, and they have been, because all these measures, you can make exceptional measures, they have to be limited to a certain time, they have to be proportionate to the need, and so on. But what it could never be cut is, or put limit, is to the freedom of press, or the freedom of expression, for example. And so in some countries, they have made it too tough, and they have gone into laws that limit the freedom of expression. Journalists have been harassed or in jail, accused of fake news, et cetera, et cetera. So there are, on the other hand, if you think on a pandemic that nobody was prepared for, even the most powerful countries, you have seen a diminishing of human rights in terms of social and economic rights and cultural rights in some places. So it is. Some are intended and some are unintended, if I may say. But of course, we have been speaking out against all these measures that have no explanation linked to the COVID-19 pandemic. And some countries have used it to increase their own power and to diminish the power of the people. And the third part is that one of the main issues in a response to a pandemic or to any health issues is that people need to have information, correct information, and needs to be able to also be able to participate, because the situation of one people and others are different. And participation is something we haven't seen almost in known countries. I mean, very few people have been able to participate in the response directly in their communities, for example, or to be heard by the authorities. So I think this is something that is linked to we have seen a little bit increase of authoritarianism, if I may say, during the last years and now with COVID-19 as well.
Well, this is something I was going to say. It was a trend, of course, that existed before the pandemic, right? That impunity in certain countries has gone up. I mean, do you think is it okay to blame that, do you think, on an absence of global leadership? A lot of people have.
Well, I think it's a mix, because I do believe that there has been a lack of leadership, but there has been negative leadership as well. I mean, what I mean is leaders need. Some leaders in many countries have denied the existence of the pandemic. They have diminished the risk of the pandemic in their speeches, and then they are sending wrong messages. But also, I think that multilateralism has been under attack for some time. And I think this is so wrong always, I think it's so wrong. But in particular, when you're thinking of a pandemic, that is something global, it's a global challenge, and no one is going to be safe by himself. We all need to be able to cooperate globally, to coordinate actions, because it's a pandemic. And this will be very important in the discussion in the future of the vaccine, for example. If you have vaccine nationalism and everyone wants to maintain the vaccine for themselves and not have access to everyone else, nobody will be safe from the pandemics, and we will be seeing it as a health crisis, but also on the other consequences as well.
Are you confident that when their vaccine does come, that the major global countries will come together, perhaps under the aegis of the World Health Organization, to make sure that the vaccine is distributed fairly and nationally?
I mean, we have been calling for that. We have been calling that the vaccine, once it's produced, a safe vaccine that produces immunity and so on, should be considered a global public good, because we need, of course, it won't be possible to do it immediately, probably, because the capacity of production might not be so high. But if I may say in some way, we will need the 7 billion people in the world to be really immune if we really want to stop the virus. So I hope that this will be heard and will be understood that it's not, it's good for everyone if everyone's safe. So in the meantime, the UN, us, WHO has been making the same calls, and I will say in the scientific community, I think there's a lot of agreement on this. Probably the biggest problem will be in terms of markets and in terms of political decisions as well.
Well, that leads me to a question. I mean, you said that multilateralism is often the thing that people point to, but of course, other stakeholders bear responsibility in this too. I mean, what do you feel, for example, for the cause of human rights, what responsibilities do major corporations have? For example, in distribution of vaccines, like you were just saying.
Well, I think I think they should get responsibility on this, and we have been discussing. We have been in a lot of webinars with business and human rights. We have this forum on business and human rights, and where a lot of people from big corporations participate. And I have been making this call, and many corporations do understand. I mean, not necessarily I've been in meetings with corporations who produce vaccines. I'm just making the advocacy to all of them to say that this is a responsibility of all of us, not only of states or WHO. I'm sure that everybody will agree on who has to receive it first, and these are the frontliners, of course, all people who are essential, health and other essential services. But the aim and the goal should be that it could be accessible and affordable for everyone.
I'd like to take us to the theme of the issue that we just published in Time this week is in partnership with the World Economic Forum on what we call the Great Reset. This idea that to turn a crisis like the COVID-19 crisis into an opportunity. Do you think this is a moment for a new compact on preserving human rights and civil liberties along the lines of what happened after World War II?
Well, I was hoping that. I was hoping that this pandemic will make people realize the importance, first of all, of, if I would say, global collectiveness. I mean, we're all part of humanity, and we all need to respect our rights. And I was suspecting, because for some time, the same time that multilateralism has been under attack, human rights concepts have been under attack as well. And it has been very difficult to include in many last year or 2 years ago in declarations the concept of human rights and so on. And I was hoping that this could be like a revival, if I may say, in terms of how important human rights are. Because of us being human beings, that's why we deserve all those human rights. That's what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights establishes. I think the framework of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is still okay. You don't need to make big changes because, for example, if you think on digital revolution, what has been defined is that what is offline is also online. I mean, the same kind of values. But of course, we will need to improve certain frameworks and certain legal instruments, for example, on all what is in artificial intelligence and so on, because all of that can be fantastic for humankind, but it can also pose a threat, because it can be used against people. So I think it's a good opportunity, but I think it has to be an opportunity also to consider that we cannot go back to normality as the day before this started, because that showed a world that was completely full of inequalities. Because what COVID-19 has laid bare is the profound inequalities, the lack of investing in health for a long time, the problems with education, the lack of for example, access to online in many parts of the world, and so on. And COVID-19 has aggravated and exacerbated those inequalities. So we should aim to go to a world where we have, I would say, real sustainable development in terms of a more inclusive economy, in terms also a fairer and greener development, with cleaner ways of energy, et cetera, et cetera. And the other thing that we need to consider seriously is to respect the nature. and the biodiversity, because many of these, all the last epidemics and pandemics, Ebola, SARS, MERS, and of course now COVID-19, are zoonoses. I mean, wild animals who either contaminate domestic animals or are eaten by human beings, and that's how this, many of these viruses spread. So we need to take really seriously nature and biodiversity. And we have now an opportunity, because this will be a discussion on the 2020 framework of biodiversity. So I hope that this opportunity is not lost, that we really use it to push forward on human rights, on respect for nature, on biodiversity, etc., and an inclusive economy, and to be able to push forward as well on the Agenda 2030. That means Agenda for Sustainable Development, that will take people out of poverty, of inequality, and could have better opportunities in life.
Well, I mean, that's a great range of challenges which you describe. I mean, probably the keenest, though, that we see is the abuses of human rights, to go back to the original question. I guess from the US perspective, which is, you know, when the US sees those kinds of abuses happening, do you think it is enough to incentivize good behavior, or should a country like the US that has a great economic authority and influence, should they be doing more to isolate or to punish that where they see it?
Oh, you mean the US attitude towards people who violate human rights?
Exactly, yes.
Well, I think they could do more. I think the US could be more, how could I say, more even, if I may say, in the analysis of human rights violations, because sometimes you know that there are countries where there are violations of human rights, but nobody says anything. So I think it will be important that the US continue engage with human rights. They decided to withdraw, from the Human Rights Council. And of course, they remain engaged with the issue, with the theme, but from outside the Human Rights Council. But I think they should do more.
The State Department launched its own commission on unalienable rights recently. Is that something that you applaud?
Well, I haven't seen the results of the commission, but I think that one important thing on human rights is that we have an international agreed framework of human rights. The Universal Declaration, there's a lot of a UN, human rights UN system. So I think we have the framework enough, the system in place that can work. So I'm not sure what that commission will bring, but I'm not sure of the reasons either for that conformation of that commission. So I will not make any prejudice, because I'm against prejudices. But of course, I think we do have in the international order enough material, enough consensus, and enough agreement. And the important thing is that everybody agrees, because the difference with other organizations is that when you are a member of a treaty body, for example, it binds you legally. It's not just you want to, no, you're obliged to really fulfill all what you are supposed to do. So I think that's the important thing. The system that we have in the UN, it can be improved. Now it's the reform of the treaty bodies that have been done by member states, but we have a good system. As always, everything can get better.
At a human level, I mean, it must be a challenge for you. This is something that you've experienced personally under Pinochet's regime, being detained, being tortured. How do you stay hopeful at a moment like this, when the pandemic gives cover to authoritarian regimes that are wanting to do this kind of behavior?
Well, but maybe I will have to remember what Desmond Tutu used to say. He uses a word I forgot, but like a prisoner of hope, if I may say. He uses another word, but means that I cannot give up. I have to continue thinking, but I have to tell you, because you were mentioning before, that I have learned in life that it's people who make decisions, political decisions, in one direction or another, it's not just because it's the right thing to do. Usually in politics, that is not very common, if I may say. So I learned that when I was at UN Women, that every time I spoke about women's rights, sometimes nobody was listening. So I understood that I had to develop a narrative where I showed that it's the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do. And I think that's one thing that maybe we can always do better, to try to communicate why something that is the right thing to do is also the smart thing to do.
It's interesting you bring up that you were the executive director of UN Women, because that's another thing that research has found during this pandemic, that gender inequality might be widened dramatically. How much of a concern is that for you?
Well, a big concern, because what we have seen is that even though the virus does not discriminate, I mean, everyone can have it, but it does impact disproportionately certain groups. Not because they are, I would say, not because they are more fragile, it's because of discrimination and inequalities for a long time. And we have seen that in older people, in women and girls, in people from the indigenous communities, people from LGBTI communities, people living with disabilities, of course, more rural and poor people. Those are the most disproportionately impacted, and minorities. And as you see in the US, for example, the numbers of people from Afro-American or Latinos who have died are bigger than the proportion in the population. So we do know, and in the case of women, this has meant, first of all, women usually work on areas, more informal areas, and many of those areas who had been really cut by the lockdown, for example, hotels, restaurants, touristic activities. Secondly, we have seen a dramatic increase of domestic violence, gender-based violence, because of the lockdown. And so many countries had started to develop a lot of different campaigns, and in many places as well, because all these shelters who protect victims of violence were closed because they were not considered essential services. So in some places they did, like Spain, Portugal, they remain as essential services. So women who had a situation could go and ask for help. And also, as I said, because in terms of the social consequences, because many times women have to take care of the older and so on. But on the other hand, if you consider women in general, it might change from one case to another. But imagine that you have a woman who's an old woman, who's living with disability, or in a rural area, or indigenous. I mean, you also will have the intersection of all these factors that will make them much more vulnerable.
Well, I think that's about all that we have time for today. Thank you very much, High Commissioner, for taking the time to talk to us at TIME100 Talks.
Thank you, Daniel.